Ace Frehley picked up his guitar, turned off the amplifier, and began to play in silence. Everyone in the studio froze because no one could understand how this guitar, making no sound, could say everything. The studio was Record Plant, Los Angeles. October 1977. Studio B. Late afternoon session. The kind of day where sunlight filters through soundproofed windows and turns amber in the cigarette smoke. Ace Frehley sat in the corner. Guitar across his lap. Not the makeup. Not the costume. Just the man. Dark hair falling across his face. Fingers resting on strings but not playing. Waiting. The producer, name forgotten now, one of those confident types who'd worked with real musicians, was explaining something to the engineer. His voice carried that particular tone. The one that says, "I know," without saying it directly. "Look, I appreciate the theatrics," the producer said, not quite looking at Ace. "Kiss puts on a hell of a show. But in here, in the studio, we need actual playing. Technical ability. You understand what I'm saying?" Ace didn't respond. He rarely did. The engineer shifted uncomfortably. He'd been in enough sessions to know when tension was building, even silent tension. "What I'm asking," the producer continued, walking toward the control room glass, "is can you play? Really play? Without the smoke and the lights and the blood and the fire?" Ace looked up. Not angry. Not defensive. Just present. "You want me to play? If you can." Ace didn't defend himself. He never did. The year before, Kiss had released Rock and Roll Over. The year before that, Destroyer. Ace Frehley, the Spaceman, the one in silver, was known for solos that bent reality. Shock Me would come later. But in 1977, some people still saw the makeup before they heard the music. The producer saw a showman. Ace Frehley saw a man who'd already decided. There's a particular kind of dismissal that comes without words. A tone. A posture. The way someone looks past you while addressing you. The producer had it. The assumption that spectacle and substance were opposites. That a man who wore platform boots and spit blood couldn't possibly understand music theory. Couldn't possibly have spent 10,000 hours in basements learning every note on a fretboard. Ace stood up slowly. He walked to the amplifier, a Marshall stack, the kind that could shake walls. He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached down and turned the power switch to off. The red LED went dark. The engineer leaned forward. "Ace, you need me too." "No." Ace pulled the cable from the guitar's output jack. It hung there, unplugged, dangling in the air like a question mark. The producer turned from the control room glass. "What are you doing? You asked if I could play?" Ace's voice was quiet. Almost conversational. "I'm going to play. The amp is off." "I know." And then Ace Frehley began to play a guitar that made no sound. His fingers moved across the fretboard with absolute precision. No hesitation. No searching for notes. His right hand worked the strings, muted, controlled, the physical motion of playing without the electrical amplification. No one could hear it. Not really. Maybe the faint mechanical sound of fingers on wire. Maybe the ghost of vibration. But nothing you could call music. Nothing that could fill a room. But everyone stopped moving. Subscribe and leave a comment, because some moments only make sense when we remember them together. The engineer stood up from his chair. The producer's expression changed, not to belief, not yet, but to something closer to confusion. Another musician who'd been setting up in the corner put down his bass and just watched. Because Ace wasn't approximating playing. He wasn't pretending. Every finger placement was exact. Every bend would have sung if there'd been power. Every hammer-on and pull-off was executed with the muscle memory of someone who'd played this progression 10,000 times in 10,000 different rooms. He played for 90 seconds. A complete musical phrase. Beginning, middle, end. His face showed nothing. No performance. No showmanship. Just the work. Just the craft. When he finished, he let his hands rest on the strings, damping them to silence. Though they'd already been silent, the room stayed quiet. Then Ace reached down, plugged the cable back into the guitar, and turned the amplifier on. The red LED glowed. The soft hum of powered tubes filled the space. "Now," Ace said, "do you want to hear it with sound?" He played the same passage. This time the Marshall stack translated his fingers into thunder. The notes filled Studio B with the kind of presence that makes mixing boards jump. Clean at first, then gradually adding the edge, the bite, the controlled fury that would later define Shock Me, and a dozen other solos that proved Ace Frehley wasn't just a showman. He was a player who happened to put on a show. When he finished, he lowered the guitar and looked at the producer. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The producer stood behind the control room glass. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. That was... He stopped. Started over. "How did you?" The precision without hearing yourself. "Muscle memory," Ace said simply. "You play something enough times, you don't need to hear it. You feel it." The engineer was nodding, almost unconsciously. He'd seen technical playing before. Studio musicians who could sight read anything, play anything, nail it in one take. But this was different. This was someone proving that the instrument wasn't the sound. The instrument was the person. The producer walked out of the control room and stood in front of Ace. For a moment, they just looked at each other. "I apologize," the producer said. "It wasn't easy for him. You could hear it. I made an assumption." Ace shrugged slightly. "People do. Could you play that again? For the track? Exactly like that? With the amp on?" A small smile. "Yeah. With the amp on." Away from the spotlight, Ace made a choice no one expected. The session continued. They recorded the track, not a Kiss song, some other project that's been lost to time now. But what happened after the session is what people remember. The producer asked Ace to stay for a moment. The engineer and the other musician had left. Just the two of them in Studio B. The late afternoon had become early evening. The amber light had gone blue. "Can I ask you something?" the producer said. Ace was putting his guitar in its case. "Sure. Why didn't you just tell me before? Why didn't you defend yourself when I questioned whether you could really play?" Ace closed the case latches. Click. Click. The sound of finality. "Because," he said, "I don't need to tell you I can play. I can just play. Words are easy. Anyone can say anything. But you can't fake muscle memory. You can't pretend your way through 10,000 hours of practice." He stood up, guitar case in hand. "People see the makeup and the fire and they think that's all it is. And I used to get angry about that. Used to want to explain. But then I realized something." "What?" "The people who matter can hear the difference. And the people who can't hear the difference, well, me talking won't change that." The producer nodded slowly. "The unplugged guitar. That was you letting me hear the difference without sound. Something like that. That's..." The producer searched for the word. "That's a hell of a way to make a point." Ace shrugged. "It's the only way that matters. Show, don't tell. Isn't that what they say?" What followed silenced everyone in the room. The story spread the way these stories do. Not through press releases or interviews. Through the network of session players and studio engineers and producers who talked to each other late at night after sessions, trading stories about the strange and the unexpected and the moments that stick with you. Within a month, 3 different musicians in 3 different cities had heard about the guy from Kiss who'd played a silent guitar in a studio, and somehow made everyone hear it anyway. The details got fuzzy. Some versions said it was a rehearsal space, not a studio. Some said Ace had played for 10 minutes instead of 90 seconds. One version claimed he'd played an entire song. But the core remained the same. Ace Frehley had been challenged, had been dismissed, and had responded not with arguments but with action. And the action had been so unexpected, so absolutely confident that it had done what no amount of explaining could have done. It had made people listen. Years later, a young guitarist who'd heard the story would ask Ace about it in an interview. This was the 1990s. The makeup was long off. The Kiss reunion hadn't happened yet. Ace was just a guy with a guitar, doing session work, playing clubs. "Is it true?" the kid asked. "Did you really play an unplugged guitar to prove you could play?" Ace thought about it. "Yeah. Why not just, play it normally? Prove it the regular way?" Because the regular way, he would have heard what he expected to hear. His brain was already made up. I needed to reset his expectations completely. Make him focus on the technique, not the volume. That's kind of brilliant. Ace smiled slightly. It's kind of necessary. When you look the way I looked, the makeup, the costume, the whole Spaceman thing, people make assumptions. They see spectacle and assume there's nothing underneath. So you have to find ways to make them see past the surface. Did it bother you? The assumptions? At first, yeah. But then I realized something. The people making those assumptions aren't your audience anyway. Your real audience, the people who actually listen, they know. They've always known. The young guitarist nodded. So the silent guitar wasn't really about proving anything to that producer. No. It was about proving something to yourself. That you didn't need his validation. Ace looked at him. Really looked. Maybe you're smarter than you look, kid. They both laughed. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The unplugged guitar became something of a legend in certain circles. Not mainstream. Kiss fans didn't know about it. Rock historians didn't write about it. But among working musicians, especially guitarists, it became a kind of parable. About ego versus craft. About showmanship versus musicianship. About the quiet confidence of someone who'd put in the hours and didn't need to announce it. Ace Frehley went on to play thousands more stages, record hundreds more solos, inspire generations of guitarists who picked up instruments because they saw a guy in silver makeup and platform boots making a guitar scream and thought that looked like freedom. But for the few people who were in Studio B that October afternoon in 1977, the most powerful thing Ace Frehley ever played was the one nobody heard. The producer, his name really is forgotten now, lost to time and fading memory, went on to work with dozens of other artists. He told the story sometimes. Late in his career, he'd mention it to young producers as a lesson. Listen past what you expect to hear, he'd say. Because sometimes the quietest thing in the room is the loudest truth. The guitar Ace played that day isn't in a museum. It's not hanging in a hard rock cafe somewhere with a plaque explaining its significance. It's probably in a case in Ace's house. Maybe he still plays it sometimes. Maybe he doesn't think about that afternoon at all. But the lesson remains. Real power doesn't need volume. Real skill doesn't need announcement. And sometimes the best way to prove you can make noise is to show what you can do in silence. Ace Frehley never defended himself that day in the studio. He didn't need to. He just played. And that was enough. The engineer who witnessed it, his name was Marcus, though nobody remembers his last name, kept a notebook. Studio engineers often do. Notes about mic placements, about which preamp worked best on which snare drum, about the particular quirks of Studio B's acoustics. On October 14, 1977, he wrote one line. Frehley played unplugged. Proved everything. That notebook is somewhere now. Maybe in a box in an attic. Maybe thrown away decades ago when Marcus retired and cleaned out his garage. But the memory stayed sharp. 20 years after that session, Marcus would be setting up mics for a different guitarist. Some session player, technically perfect but emotionally flat, and he'd think about Ace. About how technique without purpose is just exercise. About how the greatest players aren't the ones who can play the fastest or the cleanest, but the ones who understand that music isn't about the instrument. It's about what you're trying to say. Ace Frehley, sitting in that corner in 1977, wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't performing. He was simply demonstrating a fact. I know my instrument so completely that I don't need to hear it to play it perfectly. That's not showmanship. That's mastery. The producer never worked with Kiss again. Different projects, different directions, the way careers diverge in the music industry. But years later, whenever he'd hear "Shock Me" on the radio, that screaming solo, that perfect bend, that controlled chaos, he'd remember the silent version he'd witnessed first. The blueprint. The foundation that no one else had heard. And he'd turn it up a little louder,